Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Awards season continues here at Below the Line, and our jam, as regular listeners know, is film industry professionals discussing the Oscar nominees in their category of expertise. This is the fourth of 12 planned episodes, and today we're talking about production design. My guests I'm happy to share are a couple of Oscar nominees themselves. First, returning to the show is set decorator Regina Graves. Regina, your credits include The Gilded Age, The Knick, and The Irishman, for which you received your Oscar nomination. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And making his Below the Line debut is production designer Bob Shaw. Bob, your credits include Boardwalk Empire, The Wolf of Wall Street, and also The Irishman, the film for which both you and Regina were nominated. Welcome to Below the Line.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you both here. A quick note for listeners, if you go to imdb.com and search for Below the Line, you'll find every episode of the podcast with a list of my guests. And a click on their names will take you straight to their credits. Okay, the 5 2023 films nominated for production design are Barbie, Killers of the Flower Moon, Napoleon, Oppenheimer, and Poor Things. We're going to discuss them in that order, and spoilers are possible, so consider this awarding. One last reminder before we get started, we like to recognize our below-the-line compatriots by name, even if it means I'm occasionally mispronouncing some of them. Of course, Bob and Regina, you're welcome to correct me. Either way, apologies in advance to the nominees. First up for production design, Barbie. Production designer Sarah Greenwood and set decorator Katie Spencer. Start us off. What do you guys think of Barbie?
What's fascinating was that team is known for doing very, very accurate period, very detailed historical films. So I'm sure it was very exciting for them to have to create this completely different fantasy toy world. And not the designer you would have thought, but I think it was really a pretty spectacular job.
Yeah, and to go with what Bob was saying, I was just watching a little interview between the two of them, and they were saying that they do mostly like these big historic films, but they did so much research for Barbie and to get into the whole world of Barbie, and neither one of them were like Barbie enthusiasts. Neither one of them grew up playing with them. So they said like this, believe it or not, like this show was just as hard as doing something like Anna Karenina. But it was really interesting, watching them two and them discussing it and going over like all the different shades of pink that they tried out and getting into Barbie's whole world and doing like these mock models and how Barbie's like a dream house didn't have any walls and like the scale of it all and how they had to build everything in like different scales to fit how a Barbie doll would fit into the house. So a lot of that was really interesting and a lot of detail that I really took for granted because it's a contemporary film, thinking that you think sometimes that a contemporary film is much easier, but watching them and like reading about what they put into it just shows you how much goes into it because everything that they used or they, was basically built for the sets, bringing that whole Barbie world to life. I mean, I grew up playing with Barbies and it was just, it was fascinating to see it all come to life like that and feel like you're actually in it, like in Barbie's world.
Something I think that's really interesting just about the list of nominees this year is you have two, Barbie and Poor Things, which are not tethered to reality and aren't tethered to history and don't involve audience expectation of this doesn't look like Los Alamos or this doesn't look like France at the time of the revolution or post-revolution, and and then you have two that are just unhinged, which is very exciting for a designer to it's fun to do the research, but it's fun to occasionally get to make stuff up, and they had to do an awful lot of special makes on the furniture and props and a lot of custom made work there.
Yeah, and I think it all worked. It looked beautiful. Everything that they built for it really worked because it did bring the viewer into Barbie's dreamland, and that's where you wanted to be. It brought you into that space. You felt like you were a doll in this world.
So Barbie Land is getting a lot of attention, and rightfully so. And it's really carrying a lot of the conversation about this film. But talk to me about what you noticed or your thoughts on the difficulty or challenges of the real world.
Well, I think it remained a certain level of stylization, but the interesting thing was the contemporary seems to me seemed it was about the contrast of Barbie and Ken coming through another world and looking like they completely didn't belong. I heard Margot Robbie saying that one of the days when they filmed them walking on the regular street, she said she just felt like completely embarrassed because she said she looked so strange. She was used to wearing that outfit and looking like a doll in the doll world, and she felt a little self-conscious doing that in the real world. An interesting thing to me is that I think in a way the most stylized thing was the road that between Barbie Land and the real world, and that had a whole different feeling to it, and that almost felt like kind of a cartoon world. It almost reminded me of like the Roadrunner, and it had less of a reality than the individual reality that they created for Barbie Land versus the reality of the real world. But the transition felt like a whole different style to me. And I think partly it's because it was just so vast, you know. Because even with Barbie, I think when we've watched all the behind the scenes tours and the making ofs, and you can assume these days that there's a lot more stuff that's created with visual effects, and they built a lot more than you would think at first. But the road that connects the two worlds is completely fabricated, it seems.
And they also had, I've read like an 800-foot plus painted backdrop for a lot, for like their scenery and stuff. So
yeah,
like you said, some of it wasn't visual effects.
You mentioned some of the behind the scenes stuff. I know some of the categories, when they publish their short list, those folks are given the opportunity to do like a bake-off where they share some of these details. Is that afforded to production design as well, or is it more that folks just have to get their message out there about the work that they did?
I think it's they do that for some of the areas that are harder for a regular audience member to realize what's involved. Certainly, sound. People have no idea what challenges are created in the sound world, and it's a little bit the same with hair and makeup. I mean, people get an overall sense of it, but they don't necessarily realize what's involved. You don't look at something and say, I bet they sat in the chair for 6 hours. But that's often what you find out in these things, but particularly something like sound and editing. It'd be very hard for like the average person. It's even hard for me sometimes to figure out, why something was more of a challenge for the editors.
And visual effects is another one of those categories, but we'll come back to it when we're through our films. Let's move on to our second film, Killers of the Flower Moon, production design by Jack Fisk and set decoration by Adam Willis.
I'm going to be a little biased because I'm a huge fan of obviously Marty's movies and a really big fan of Jack Fisk. And I had the opportunity to interview him or have like a little talk with he and Adam about the film. What I love about Killers is that, again, it's based on a true story. So a lot of it, is based on facts, and it's kind of like not a documentary, but they're reliving certain pieces. But what I love about this is how they built a lot of like these outbuildings and, just like, I don't know, the history of it all in that time period. And it's probably like, that's like a film that I would love to work on. And I was really like taken by all of the sets and how beautifully, I just felt like I was in it, and you just brought me back to a place. I thought all their choices were, top notch without being like, exceptionally beautiful or what have you. I just felt like everything was real. And again, like talking with Adam and Jack and how they worked with each other really gave me an appreciation for the both of them even more so, and how they like just kind of delved into it and really loved. And you could just tell that all the choices that were made were just really thought about. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what else to say other than I think it's a great looking film, and it was rightfully so nominated.
I think they did a great job of putting you in the time and place.
Yeah.
And I know from working with Scorsese that he often wants. Sometimes he'll say something shouldn't draw attention to itself, or he once told me something should look like nothing. And I think he's trying to set the world, but not in a flashy way, not in an ostentatious way. And so it's not like, oh wow, that was an eye-popping set, or oh, that was so gorgeous. But it totally creates the environment and creates a different time. And it also is an area that's sort of been underserved in being depicted on film. I love the film itself because it's one of those things where you say, did that really happen? And bringing a historical moment to life that had been sort of under discussed without. I have a tendency to look at pieces of furniture or fabrics or draperies and say it needs to sit back and behave itself. And this was that kind of film. I mean, if you really start analyzing frame by frame, you start seeing the details, you start seeing the Native American fabrics, you see all of that stuff, but it's not in your face, and it's very subtle. And I think I'm happy that it was recognized, because often subtlety isn't recognized.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly how I felt, but you said it in much better words than I did.
I don't know about that, but we're both very, very prejudiced towards Scorsese.
Yeah, but I just something about that film. I really think it's probably my favorite Scorsese film ever. Even over Goodfellas, which that's hard to beat. But yeah, I just think the film in a whole is yeah, beautiful to look at. But like I said, it's and like you said, it just sits back and relax. It's not like anything is in your face. It was just done very well. It told the story, not taking away from the movie itself.
I think it was a couple of months ago, I read an article in the New York Times where the reporter had interviewed Jack Fisk and some of the work that went into this. And I was struck by decisions like putting the barber shop in the pool hall, or again, if I'm getting this, but these ideas that were meant to subtly, as you say, but to tie in the story in ways, and the open streets, and just how it all fit together. And so I had a sense of all the work that went into this as well from that article. There was an interesting thing in the article, though, that, and I don't know if anyone read it, but it had a tone as if what Jack Fisk was doing was really more than what production designers do in general. But having talked to so many of you, I got a sense that while his work is exemplary, not to take anything away from it, that is the effort of production design on any production, small or large. And I was curious whether you're going to tell me, no, this really is next level, unprecedented sort of work that normally you're not afforded that opportunity, or if indeed, yes, it's exemplary, but everyone aspires to do that on their project, large or small.
I think doing the research and doing the homework actually is one of the most satisfying parts of the job, and getting to the point where you really know the material, and this chair wouldn't be there, this vase wouldn't be there, these people wouldn't have a vase or whatever. There's a lot of kind of almost archaeology, anthropology, whatever, some kind of ology involved. That you really have to study the material, and that's one of the great satisfactions of the job. And one time you could be researching Los Alamos, another thing you could be researching this world where the white people are meeting, colliding in the same world as the Native Americans, and you have to do the research to get it to feel real. I don't have anything to say about the particular amount of research they did, but it's really one of the big parts of the job, particularly if you do things that are period. It's interesting because many years ago I worked as the art director on the Ice Storm, and it was set on the East Coast of the U.S. in the 70s. And I started, it's like, well, I know this, I was alive, and the director Ang Lee was not from this culture, and so things that he would notice that we didn't notice because we thought we knew it. And you find that you even have to do research on a period that you lived in, because you would say, wait a minute, did that tape recorder exist? Did I get that in seventh grade or did I get that when I was in high school? And I learned through that show that you even have to research, fairly recent periods because you can't trust your memory or you can't trust your sense of it. And then remember they gave us a book of like a Xerox book of research that was the size of a phone book. And I thought initially like, well, I don't need this. And then I was constantly referring to it.
Well, it occurs to me, and because you've both worked with Scorsese before, that he allows and budgets for and gives the time to do the kind of research you're talking about. Not every production affords the production designer to do the amount of work that it has, or is that more common than maybe I would guess?
Well, Scorsese also has this brilliant researcher named Marianne Bauer, who I think is also one of the producers on the film. Been with him for years and years, and it's a different level of research than we often do. There's a difference between really being a researcher and being a Googler. And when people Google research, it happens all the time. You have a well-intentioned person in the art department who's doing research, and they'll show you 10 images, and you'll say 6 of them are from movies. And that happens all the time. That you have to be careful not to, get research that's from a movie. Because then there are certain things that have been seen in movies so many times, people think that that was a bit of reality. And it's like, no, it's just a location that got used a lot. Real in-depth research is a very, very specific field, and a lot of people do a different level of it.
Let's take that challenge into the third film on our list, another period drama, Napoleon. Production designer Arthur Max, set decorator Ellie Griff.
Well, as happens sometimes, I was actually more engaged by the design than by the film. And that was one that, it's an occupational hazard, I guess, with what we do, of scrutinizing it and trying to figure out what were set extensions and what were real. And, before you do period films, you think, oh, well, you get a bunch of old houses and you go in them and you film. And, the scale of that film was just immense. I mean, I say all the time again that when you're charged with doing a certain film, even if it's big, even if it's ambitious, you start breaking things down and you figure out, how am I going to do this? To me, a sign that is something that I think is like a nominated film was like, I look at it and go, how did they do that? And I'm always looking at other people's work and thinking, how did they do that? And I know for myself, and certainly I imagine Regina feels the same way. When we look at it, and we're just a little baffled as how they did it. That it's definitely puts it in a certain class when we're kind of amazed by it. Don't you think, Regina?
Definitely. But like you, I watched the movie, but just tried to watch the sets because the movie itself wasn't my favorite. But again, I think this is a case where a lot of people would think, oh, what's so great about this film? They probably shot them all on location in these big, historic mansions or what have you. But I was reading that they filmed most of it in London or like in England, not France. And one of the main houses was, I don't know what it's called, but it's like the Versailles of England or something like that. But what a lot of people don't know, Bob and I have experienced, filming in some of these big grand locations. You don't just walk in and film as is. A lot of it you have to, like the majority, you have to take all the stuff out. Yes, it's a great backdrop, the walls, everything, the architecture is there, but you can't just walk in and use like all their furnishings. You can't sit on these chairs from, the 1600s. I mean, everything basically gets taken out, and we're redressing this whole set like it's a stage set. So much work goes into it. But
it's really ironic.
Yeah. And the vastness of it all. Yeah. Of all these sets were just, like you said, I sit there and go, oh my God, how'd they do all that? Especially the battle scenes with all those tents. It's just like, it blows me away. But again, I think it's a beautiful film.
It's one of the things we learned, I think, even more from doing working on Gilded Age and looking at the period films, and go into a historic place and say, oh, it's just perfect. And you basically have to empty the room out.
The whole, yeah.
Yeah, and you can't have someone sitting on a fabric that might be the original 100-and-some-year-old fabric.
Hmm.
That's something an audience would never know. You just show up. They just don't. They don't charge you the admission, and you go in and you film. So it's daunting. I mean, because every one of those rooms had to be refurnished and redecorated, and
And like I said, not even the rooms. I mean, the battle scenes. I just don't even know where to begin on the tents and this all of that stuff. But again, it was a huge epic thing.
shots were so deep. I mean, the background just went on and on forever.
Hmm.
And that gets to where that's when you figure, well, there must be some extensions involved here because you just don't find blocks and blocks or a mile or the volume.
An extension for folks who don't know, Bob, you're talking about like where the visual effects will come in and make it larger or more of a vista or just aspects of the building or the tents, as Regina's mentioned, that weren't actually set up but are added later.
Right. You might build a facade of a building or a facade of two buildings, but you need to look down the street, and then the buildings that you have built are just the launching point, and then they have to extend it and add the rest of the block. And there's certain guidelines that get complicated that you have to figure out. They usually want something real behind the actor. It's a complicated formula of figuring out what to build and what to hand to VFX.
But you can't actually decide on the day. It has to be decided well in advance if any of
It
it's
has
going
to
to
be
be ready for filming.
Although it's surprising the number of times it happens on any film where you've all done all your planning and you're going to see this side of the street and the shot's going to be this and the shot's going to be that, and then something happens on the day and they say, well, okay, we're going to look in this direction instead, so can you throw a green screen behind these four people in the scene and figure it out later? And I know that the visual effects people are like, I don't have this in my budget, or we weren't prepared to do this, and it's surprising how often that things don't stick to plan. And when people kind of get upset in the art department, I said, what, you're going to tell somebody you had a better idea last night, but you're not allowed to use it because of what you told us 2 weeks ago. Even in a big, meticulously planned film, they have to allow for some things that happen in the moment.
Regina, you also mentioned on the set decoration side, going into these historic buildings, needing to remove the furniture. Does that mean that there's a lot of fabrication, or is there a market of furniture for film sets that looks like it's centuries old?
Well, it really depends. It depends. Like New York City, unfortunately, doesn't have a huge market for period furnishings. I mean, we have like one prop house, two prop houses, but sometimes we don't want to use that because so many people have. So it really depends where they are. I'm sure. I mean, I read that the decorator Ellie on this film rented from a lot of prop houses in England. I'm assuming that in Europe, maybe these prop houses are big and fast. Sometimes we do have to go out and fabricate things, or we find the furniture, the old furniture, and have to have it refinished and reupholstered. So it really just depends, like where you are, as far as like in the world and what's available to you.
I mean, ideally, you have the time and the resources to
Yeah.
reupholster things and refinish things, because otherwise, if you were only relying on what you were getting from the rental house, you would sort of lose control of the palette and the tone. It's hard to maintain, the look that everyone has agreed upon when you're renting a lot of things. And sometimes they say, oh, you can't reupholster that, and then we have to look somewhere else because it doesn't fit into the color scheme. So they had to contend with all of that on a massive, massive scale.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to find things myself and have it reupholstered and just make it our own. But sometimes you also don't have the time to do that. It really just depends the timing, what's available to you, and all those different circumstances. And if when you're working on a TV show, it's different because you have things that are made for like permanent sets that have to be there forever.
Well, moving on to the fourth film on our list, Oppenheimer. Production designer Ruth de Jong and set decorator Claire Kaufman.
Well, this was pretty meticulously researched as well. I happen to have worked on a project that I didn't actually complete. That was going to be the Manhattan Project. So I had at one point done the research on this is what the entrance looked like. this is what the gathering place they was, and trying to figure out which things they built. Obviously, they built the entrance to whatnot, and so it was all very, very spot on accurate. The only comment I had at all was that a lot of it looked a little new to me, like the entrance to the Los Alamos project there looked pretty new. You could argue that they had recently constructed it, but you're in the desert and there's an awful lot of dust and things flying around, and it's also hard to aging things and making things look lived in is tough, because there's a fine line between getting something that's realistic and then accidentally slipping into a horror film. I mean, it happens all the time. I mean, you can't see the aging, you can't see the aging, you can't see it, and then suddenly the next step, it's too much. So it's one of the subtleties of design, and it's one of the trickiest things to get right.
Yeah, I feel like, again, this was another one of my favorites. I do agree with you on like the aging of things, but what I did take away from a lot of it was it seemed to me like the sets weren't chock full of stuff. I felt like things were really scaled back. They weren't as layered as like a lot of period films are, and I think that was maybe done intentionally, because it kind of brought other things like to life, like the atom bomb, or like things in the research lab.
Well, there's also the aspect that there's the aspect that they were assigned or recruited to go work on this project at Los Alamos and bring their families and try and create the sense of a community. But they obviously didn't bring everything they owned, and they also didn't know how long they were going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know that someone would have decamped to Los Alamos and brought, grandmothers this and that.
Yeah.
So I think it was temporary housing. So I think it's kind of appropriate that it wasn't overly layered.
Definitely. And that's what I'm saying. I think it was done like intentionally. And I also read that about this show, that I couldn't believe it, that they shot it in like 57 days, and they had over 150 or something sets. So that's a really, 150 or plus sets in 57 days. And it didn't have this huge budget like people thought they did. So I think that's a feat in itself, like just trying to catch up with all of that, but there are things, again, with the set dressing, how I'm saying like less is more, but it worked for them. You know how we do a set, and when there's blank walls, everyone always says, oh my God, there's a blank wall. There has to be something on the wall. Like I felt like with Oppenheimer, there wasn't a lot of artwork. There wasn't like tons of things on the walls, and it worked.
That's something that's frustrating for what we do, because there's a pitfall can be that people are composing for every frame. They're not composing for the room. So if you've done a certain amount in a given room, and then one side doesn't have this much on the wall, or maybe doesn't have anything on the wall, and a lot of people are afraid to let any frame go kind of uncomposed.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's tricky, because the same thing, the difference between unmotivated pieces of dressing hanging on the wall and then overly stark, it's hard to get that right, which I think they did. And it's the same thing with the aging. There's a very fine line between not enough and too much, or not being realistic. It happens all the time that someone says, "Is there anything to put in frame?" And you can watch the dailies and go like, "Who put that there?" Happens all the time.
Definitely.
It's tricky. It's tricky.
But again, I think you can compare this to like Killers of the Flower Moon. And again, a film like this, because it's not it's a big period piece, but it's not like this big gorgeous deco, kind of movie or something, but it was still recognized for all of its work and for what it brought to the screen.
It's creating a world again,
Mm-hmm.
a time and a place, and an environment, and it was very successful at doing that.
I agree.
Well, the fifth film on our list is creating a fantastical world, and that's Poor Things. Production design by James Price and Shauna Heath. set decoration by Suja Mia. And this is where you're supposed to tell me if I pronounce those wrong, and you know
And we don't know.
It sounded good to me.
it.
This is another one where it's such a fantastical world that we looked at it a lot, and it's like, what did they build, and what was an enhancement? And I was kind of astonished to see how much they built. I mean, that whole Parisian square, that the whole scientist's house, all of that, and again, it's probably both exciting and daunting to make so much up from scratch, because it was kind of like wacky Paris. I mean, it was all reconceived. It was all heightened, and I mean, I have to say, certain parts of it made me a little queasy, because it's sort of so to me, it can be a very dark vision and can be very kind of unsettling, and so to a certain extent, some of the looks made me a little uncomfortable, and I think, again, that's probably part of the intention. But it was very intense, like a lot of incense or something. But they built a lot.
They did build a lot. Yeah. From a decorator standpoint, I have to say this was like eye candy for me. I was just so taken with, oh my God, like the quilting on the walls and every little detail, and the in her bedroom, I was like, is it carpeting? Is it padded? It's tufted. What is that? Everything was kind of, like Bob said, heightened, and either things were really like large scale, like the chairs in like the kitchen where they sat, and all the plates on the walls, from the ship with the kind of Art Deco. And it was just, everything, it felt like they just had a freedom with this to do whatever they wanted with it, to decorate however they want, design however they want with it. And it just looked like a really fun, I'm saying as an outsider, film to work on. I thought it was fantastic looking. It was like something you didn't really see before. I love the movie itself because it was so out there. And like Bob said, so many sets were built, because I always look that up. What did they build? What didn't they build? Where were they? And I don't know. I just thought it was a lot of eye candy and something that was really exciting and new to me.
Well, it's got an Alice in Wonderland kind of quality to it, in that you're definitely, even in a different dimension. This is some kind of alternative universe or something.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very consistently designed for the aesthetic, the look that they established. And when you're doing something like that, you have to sort of make your own rules, so that, in order to keep things consistent. Because even though there's a lot of fantastical things and a lot of invention, you have to make it look like it was invented as part of the same world and by the same people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it had a very consistent look. I mean, honestly, it was one of my favorites, even though I definitely found it unsettling at times. I can be a little conventional, and the objective isn't always pretty. The objective can be unsettling. The objective can be creepy. The objective can be to make it clear that this is a whole other world that you've never seen before.
Yeah, and that's what I think I liked about it the most. It was just something that I haven't really seen on screen before.
And in this is a case where the production design and the sort of where it's difficult or disorienting clearly serves the story, since that seems to be the point of the story overall, and it's rowing in the same direction without a doubt.
Well, sometimes when something's creepy, you both love it and you don't love it. I mean, like when I was a kid, I loved watching The Wizard of Oz, but there were certain parts where I always closed my eyes.
It has that kind of, I thought about like The Wizard of Oz in a different way, or like Willy Wonka in a different way. It kind of reminded me, just kind of like out there.
Yeah. But
this was a little further out there. But I thought it looked fantastic.
Definitely through the looking glass.
Yeah. There's a lot of great films this year. I don't know. It's a hard one. And they're all so different, different, same, not. And how do you choose one over the other? It's just it's hard.
There's almost like two different camps. There's the sort of fantasy side, and then there's the historical side. And even within the historical side, you have the flamboyance of Napoleon versus
Napoleon.
the very real, very unobtrusive design of Killers of the Flower Moon and Oppenheimer.
Hmm. Be curious to see which way it goes.
Well, fortunately, we're not going to put you on the spot to pick winners on this show. However, I am going to ask, what other films in 2023 would you have liked to have seen nominated for achievement in production design? In other words, what films are maybe overlooked, not on this list? You don't need to say which of these you would drop off, but what else caught your attention that we want to shine a light on?
I think Regina just mentioned Wonka. That was very
Yeah.
through designed. Yeah.
I wouldn't drop any off the list because I think everyone on this list is deserving. But Wonka, you know, if they had like 7 choices instead of 5, I think Wonka, you know, that was really something. And Asteroid City, the movie itself wasn't recognized, but I always think like his movies just always have that certain look, and I don't think there was ever a Wes Anderson film that didn't look, you know, 100%, that didn't, you know, have like that certain look.
I mean, Maestro's a possibility, because that's another one where it was you know, very reality based and you know, creating the world they lived in, but it wasn't, you know, like dazzling, you know.
Yeah, it wasn't in your face.
But I thought that was a very, very well designed show that probably would have grabbed a nomination in a different year.
Mm-hmm.
That's always the interesting thing about the Oscars, is that there are shows, there are performances that you assume were Oscar winners, and then you find out no, they weren't even nominated. It was a big year, and you know, all the time. You know, when you really look at the history of the Oscars, there are things that you assume would have been winners that weren't nominated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but this year it's a really good year for film. I feel like we're back. Like, you know, in the past couple of years, it's been like, so. This year, it's been, you know, pretty exciting to watch them all.
I am hearing that on a lot of our episodes. There is one thing from another episode that I want to put before the two of you. The one before this, 3 days ago, we were focused on visual effects. And there were 3 films that my visual effects guests thought were overlooked in their category. And that was Oppenheimer, Barbie, and Poor Things. Now, all 3 of those show up on this list. And we talked a little bit about the interaction between visual effects, production design, as visual effects is doing more and more. Is a lot of that work properly placed under production design, as maybe it was with these films? Or is that relationship just getting more complicated? And what do you guys foresee for the future?
I think it's changed a lot in the last 10 or 12 years. And projects that I personally worked on like 12 years ago, we finished and wrapped and like on Boardwalk Empire, and then gave them some research and some pencil drawings, and then just saw what they did. And you know, now there are a lot more people doing 3D work in the art department, and so I think we're able to, you know, before we're all sent home at the end when we wrap, you know, give a much more fleshed out version of what we think, you know, the rest looks like. And then it's going to continue to change because I haven't really worked on it, but Regina's had the experience of working on a show that was using the volume stage, you know, where they, you know, build certain set pieces, but for the most part, everything is on, you know, this wraparound LED screen or giant LED screen, whatever it is. And that changes the formula where a lot of the work has to be done up front, because the idea is that there's whatever projected behind them has to have already been done and figured out in pre-production. So that's kind of changing the ball game, you know, as it gets to be used more and more, which I think it will be, of wrapping the job and then having these people just sort of make up the rest on their own. It's going to skew things back toward pre-production, don't you think?
I think so. I'm surprised that Barbie wasn't nominated for visual effects.
I am too. It's such a clear
Or even Poor Things.
blend. Poor Things really, they both surprised me because they leave us guessing like where the reality begins and ends, and how much was extended. And I think clearly there were a lot of visual effects employed, and the idea that they were nominated is a little surprising.
Hmm.
I mean, Oppenheimer, again, that's where that looks so real that it's even hard for us to really tell.
Yeah.
So I assume that the visual effects experts are certainly better informed than we are.
Are there 5 nominees like every other category for visual effects?
Yes.
And what were they?
And so the visual effects films were Napoleon. It was on both lists. But after that, they had The Creator, Godzilla -1, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and the Mission Impossible film.
Well, that's interesting because, in the lead up to the Oscars, because we're supposed to work on nominations in the categories, I always make sure to watch the movies that aren't necessarily things that I would go to see in a theater, because I'm pretty far away from being a teenager. But Guardians of the Galaxy, you look at that show and you can see certain things that you're pretty sure they built, but then there's just so much. I mean, that there's just so much invention, so much visual effects. I mean, as much as there are in Barbie or in Poor Things. I mean, there were entire worlds they had to create. I think there's probably more instances where people were probably on a blank stage with everything else being put in after the fact. And maybe that's something that, visual effects people are a little more attuned to.
Bob, you reminded me that last year, Avatar: Way of Water was nominated for production design, with the idea of it being that visual. All of it has to be designed from scratch, which can be harder in some ways.
It's just, I mean, that's another one where I look at those films and, as a production designer, even figuring out what you're supposed to do and what somebody else is supposed to do is daunting. I mean, it's and there's a little bit of thing as a designer, you tend to want to build more or make more, because I don't know whether it's a control issue or an ego issue, but you don't want to put more of a stamp on it.
Well, I very much appreciate you guys sharing your insights about these films. On that note, we're going to call it a wrap. Great having you guys here.
Okie doke. Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. You can find my contact info on our website, belowtheline1word.biz. That's B-I-Z. I hope you're enjoying our Oscar coverage, and please subscribe to the podcast if you're not doing so already. We'll be back again with another episode in 3 days. My closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. To all of our listeners, I appreciate you. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line.